Hey folks, I'm going to be covering my round 5 game from last night here at the US Open being played in downtown Grand Rapids, Michigan. I've actually been streaming these game recaps, but today I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to record it and then release it straight to YouTube. But yeah, this was my round 5 game. This was played against Austin Earsley, who was USCF rating was around 1941, but definitely I felt during the game that he was a very kind of underrated player. So e4, I went c5, knight f3, knight c6, and lately I've been playing the Sveshnikov, so I kind of stuck to my opening here. D4, I went cd4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, e5, knight db5, d6, this is all well known, and now knight d5. So trendy line, we saw this one in the Caruana-Carlsen World Championship match. I played knight takes d5, e takes d5, and now knight e7. Black also has the move knight to b8, but I generally prefer this one here. I feel like it's more dynamic. And my opponent was still playing pretty quickly at this point. He now went c3, which I think is one of the many moves in this position. I think c4 is probably the main line. I went knight f5, which I looked at a little bit not too long ago, so I was kind of familiar with some of the ideas in this position. Black is basically looking to develop the kingside, castle, and eventually try to use the kingside majority. So white played a4, bishop d7, bishop d3, bishop e7, castles, castles. And yeah, there's lots of ways I think white can play this position, but he chose king h1, which I think is a reasonable move. A lot of times this sets up the idea to push f4, which white can try in the position, and the king just gets off of the diagonal. So here I played a6, knight a3, and b5. And during the game I wasn't 100% sure, but I think this was about as far as I had prepped. And I remembered that this was a playable idea. White can't take twice on b5 because the rook is hanging on a1. And so black gets a little bit of counterplay on the queen side. Black is also looking to play bishop g5 at some point, trade off the dark square bishops, and then get the queen to g5, where the queen is pretty active, and then black can look for like knight h4 and this kind of attacking idea on the king side. So yeah, I wasn't super familiar with this position. I just kind of understood some general principles. So now I play knight c2, and at this point I was definitely not sure what to do. I basically considered two moves here, either b takes a4 or just the immediate bishop to g5. And I ended up going with ba4, but I do kind of regret the decision. I think I should have went for this one instead. What I wasn't sure about after a takes b5, let's say bishop takes c1, queen takes, a takes b5, rook takes a8, queen takes a8, knight b4. Some position like this was pretty unclear to me exactly what's going on here. If it's equal, if I'm worse. I didn't really think black could be better here in some situation like this. The knight on b4 just looks very stable. b5 pawn is kind of a target. But I think black is probably okay, like analyzing a little bit after the game, maybe like knight e7 here. I can go g6, f5 somewhere, controlling the c6 square. I do think black is fine, and I probably should have went for something like this, let's say objectively. I decided to take on a4. To me, this looked quite playable. But now white plays knight b4, and it does get a little dicey here because white has this idea to go knight c6, and if I'm forced to give up my light square bishop, I have to be very careful that white doesn't get a very strong pawn on c6 supported by the bishop on e4. So I thought this could be really, really bad. So I ended up playing bishop g5 here. After a bit of a think, I realized I have to make this move now. And white has a few options, but I was mainly looking at knight c6 here. And I wasn't sure what's going to happen. Because I can play queen f6, but I can also take. And then after, let's say, d takes c6, bishop takes c1. If white takes back on c1, like queen c1 or rook c1, then I thought knight e7 and this pawn is going to be pretty weak. And I should be able to pick it up, and black should be doing well. And then on bishop takes f5, I really wasn't sure what to make of this position. Like bishop takes b2, Black is currently up 2 pawns, but like a4 is hanging. White has queen c2. Of course, the c pawn is pretty strong. I was definitely afraid of the move rook takes a4. I thought was the most natural. And then white has ideas like rook c4 and c7. So this I felt like would be pretty unclear, and I wasn't sure how I would continue from here. But I felt like this is at least playable. I didn't think I'm in huge trouble. For example, I could take, and then on rook c4, there's still bishop a5 covering c7. And okay, white has a very strong c pawn, but black has a couple extra pawns, and we get the blockade. And all right, feels like a very, very playable position still. So yeah, if knight c6, I was going to choose between this one or playing queen f6 here, which I wasn't totally sure about, because now white can take on g5. Let's say queen takes g5, go rook takes a4, and then obviously the a pawn is a big weakness, and it's not clear if black is going to have like enough counterplay on the king side. So it's essentially going to have to evaluate between these two options. And I think black does have some chances here, but yeah, if white plays well, then of course we're always taking a lot of risk by leaving this pawn weak. So here my opponent spent a lot of time, as far as I remember, and ended up playing bishop takes f5, which I wasn't unhappy to see, because now I get the bishop, white goes knight c6, I got to go queen f6 to keep in contact with g5, and here he takes, queen takes g5, and now rook takes a4. And yeah, I wasn't sure how to evaluate this position, because I felt like it's very double-edged. I clearly have a pawn on a6 that's very weak, and white can easily target. But on the other hand, I have a very strong bishop, and I feel like my piece is potentially better than the knight, although it very much depend on what happens. But even though this knight on c6 looks very strong, it's on this outpost and controlling a lot of squares, it's doing all of its damage on the queen side. So my approach to this position was to try and play on the king side, where the knight, is doing very little. So basically my plan was, in some order, to go rook e8, e4, and e3. And I felt like if I could get this pawn break in, maybe my bishop can come to e4. That's what I thought would actually give black some serious counterplay in this position. Of course, if I do nothing, then I thought, I could just be busted, because white goes after the a pawn, starts pushing like b4, c4, and just crashes through on the queen side. So after some thought, I decided to start with rook f8. I feel like this was the most flexible move. e4 as well was possible, but then I thought white can go queen e2, and then queen e3 was kind of unpleasant for me. So I wanted to start with rook f8. This also covers the e7 square, which tactically is, of course, a very vulnerable square. So I wanted to make sure that this knight is kept under cover. And here white played queen e2, which I thought was quite logical. And here I spent some time again, because originally I wanted to play e4. Then I didn't like this move queen e3 that white could play, and I don't really want to go for the endgame. I'm trying to keep the queens on the board and play for activity. And here I wasn't sure like where to put the queen, and I felt like now white can also get in with like queen b6 maybe somewhere. Of course, that would allow e3, so I'm not sure I would be super worried about queen b6. But yeah, I didn't quite want to allow this move. And another idea I came up with was queen g6, which I actually thought was quite strong at first, threatening bishop d3. And I thought if white goes like rook e1, for example, I can go bishop d3 anyway, and then plant my bishop on b5, where it's very strong. I thought it's active, it's defending my weakness, and I can always trade off on c6 if I feel like I can pick up this pawn. So it's kind of like a nice option to have. But then I realized on queen g6, white is a very tricky move here. Rook takes a6. That's playable. Very funny move, putting the rook on just like the worst possible square. But actually the tactics, I think, work out for white, because white has knight e7 check in the position. So, for example, bishop d3, white just plays this one. If I take, it's a back rank mate. And unfortunately, if I move my king anywhere, knight's taking on g6 with check. Otherwise, maybe I could keep, going down the line. White takes my queen, I take on e2, and who knows. But white's taking the queen with check, and so we're just dead lost. So bishop d3 doesn't work, and if I take once and go bishop d3, then again, white has knight e7 check, which is very unfortunate. And again, I have back rank issues, and also if I move my king, then the queen is hanging with check. So this unfortunately wasn't working. And maybe I can consider rook takes a6 like some rook move and then keeping the threat of bishop d3 alive. But this gives white a tempo. So, for example, knight b4 covers the square. And yeah, it's not clear what black got for the pawn just yet. So I had to discard queen g6 after queen e2. Eventually I came up with what I thought was a very interesting way to play. I went bishop g6. And the point of this move was that I didn't want to commit to e4 just yet, but I wanted to improve my positioning on the king side. So number one, the bishop is now protected, so knight e7 check is not as annoying. Number two, I can push f5 and start running the f pawn and get the king side pawns moving. And finally, I can also play e4, which opens up the queen on to the d5 pawn. So my first idea, one thing I have to mention, I noticed that, okay, if white takes on a6, which was very possible, then I do have bishop e4 at the end of the line, so that's why I wasn't exactly worried about the a pawn. And this position I wasn't sure how to judge. After f3 takes, white has this move knight b4. Otherwise, black is doing great. After winning the d5 pawn, the bishop is super strong. But knight b4 was a problem because it hits both the bishop and the pawn. And yeah, I felt like this should be very reasonable for black after e4, where I just open up the diagonal and I'm really harassing white on the g2 square. But yeah, overall, I mean, I thought it was kind of unclear, but I was willing to go into it. I thought it's very playable. So that was the first idea behind bishop, or one of the ideas behind bishop g6, that I'm not worried about white taking the pawn. And if rook a1, which happens in the game, then I was planning to go e4, and then finally get this break with e3, which I thought is quite strong. One trick I had in mind here was if white had played f3, which I thought is kind of natural because it looks like it's stopping e4. I realized I could play e4 anyway, with the point f takes e4, queen takes d5, which I felt like was a very nice resource, because I take this pawn on d5, white loses the stability for their knight, and then after ed5, rook takes e2. I thought this endgame is very nice for black, where I have the rook on the 7th rank, and I have bishop e4 coming, and yeah, I feel like I have enough activity here to totally justify giving up the a pawn. So I was definitely hoping for that. Instead, white played rook a1. I went e4, and here white plays rook takes a6. I think this kind of makes sense. At this point, queen e3 is no longer super logical because I can just take on d5. So rook takes a6, I trade. White has to take with the queen because if rook takes, there's queen c1 with mate. So queen takes a6. And I can't take on d5 here because there's knight e7 check, followed by queen a8 or queen c8 and a back rank mate. But I do get e3, and so I felt pretty good here about my position because I felt like I'm activating all my pieces on the king side. Bishop is coming to e4, and I thought I'm definitely winning the d5 pawn, which should give me plenty of further counterplay. So here white has a lot of options. If takes on e3, I think I was going to start with bishop e4. And for example, one interesting idea I was thinking about during the game after rook to g1, of course black could take on e3 or take on d5. I'm only going to be a pawn down with a ton of activity, a lot of compensation. I can probably win both of these pawns at some point. But another idea that really attracted me was to just play h5 here. The idea of just running the pawn down to h3, with the idea that if white ever plays h3, of course, then black gets queen g3, and then it's very hard for white to defend both of these squares. So I felt like this is actually a very, very annoying idea for white as well. So white ends up playing queen e2, which I thought was a reasonable move. If rook e1, kind of the same idea with the pin on the e-file, then I think I was going to go e2 with the pretty annoying threat of just getting my queen to d2, and then if this pawn is on the board, I thought it's just very, very strong for black and super annoying for white to deal with it. So I evaluated this position as being pretty good. So queen e2 was played, and one last detail that I thought was nice, but I had to see before going into this, was in case of queen a8 in this position, which at first glance feels like a shock because it looks like we might just be getting mated. Rook f8 would be met with queen takes f8, followed by rook a8, and another mate on the back rank. But thankfully black can play f5 here, or f6 I think might also be okay. But I was probably just going to go f5, and now white's queen is actually hanging for real. Of course, now I still have threats with the the e pawn, e takes f2, and e2, and so I think this would just be losing for white, but very important trick in the position. So queen e2 played. Now, of course, I can't take on f2 right away, so I played bishop e4. I think queen takes d5 was also very possible. But I played this one, and I was expecting here either f3 or f takes e3. White ends up going f e3, which makes sense. If f3, then the pawn on e3 is just very, very strong. So f e3 played. Bishop takes d5. And here I honestly got a little bit lucky because I definitely hadn't anticipated my opponent's next move when we reached this position. And I should have spent more time here before taking and double checking, because black can also take with the queen and be absolutely fine, as well as just play a move like h5 and have a completely acceptable position where we're about to win one pawn back and then we have plenty of compensation for the second pawn. But I kind of quickly took on d5, which was a huge mistake because I didn't realize until I made my move that white has this rook a5 idea in the position. And I immediately got very scared because I hadn't anticipated this idea. And sometimes when you miss a move, you don't know. It could just be straight up losing for your position. Now, intuitively, I felt like black should have something. So I didn't go into a total panic, especially because I noticed white's back rank was weak and I thought I should have some idea, like some queen g6, queen f5 to make it work. But while my opponent was thinking, I was definitely kind of nervously trying to figure out a solution here. And eventually he does go rook a5. And my first thought, queen g6, doesn't work because white can just play rook takes d5. And if I give the check on b1, white has rook d1 blocking. Another move, rook c8, also doesn't work because it's just rook takes d5. And I can't take back because knight e7 check. So at this point, I definitely started to panic a little bit. I thought about queen f5, which I thought was a good try. Because for the moment, white is threatening c4. This is white's main threat. Knight b4 is not a threat because then I can take on g2 and the rook hangs. But since the rook is defended, c4 is a huge threat. So queen f5, that deals with c4, but it takes the pressure off of g2. So I thought this is okay because then maybe I get a tempo and I can unpin here. But then I realized white has the very strong move queen d1, covering the back rank and hitting the bishop. And I have nothing better than this move, bishop b3. So thankfully I don't lose the piece immediately, but after knight e7 check, if I take, there's rook a8, let's say king moves, knight takes here, bishop takes d1, knight takes d6. I'm definitely not winning this endgame. In fact, I didn't even see this during the game, but if I go rook takes e3, white actually has rook a8 check immediately and knight f5. And this is just immediately game over. So I can't even take on e3 here. So black would just be in big trouble. So my opponent plays rook a5, and I'm sitting at the board. And then finally, when this move is actually on the board, I realized what I need to do here. And it turns out black actually has a very nice solution. And that is the move h6. So what I realized, of course, is that our real issue is the back rank. And so, that's why we can't play a move like queen takes e3, because white trades and then rook a8. Or rook takes e3 also is dealt with rook a8 check. So by playing h6 and creating a square for the king, we're actually able to set up counterplay connected with either queen takes e3 or rook takes e3. And it's very important to play h6 because this defends the queen. So for example, some lines. First of all, if c4, then queen takes e3. Black is hitting the queen. And then after trades, rook takes. Black is actually winning because of the threat of white's back rank, as well as the knight on c6. So white is just losing here. So c4 is not working. Knight b4 is also out because the bishop takes g2. And the queen can't move anywhere because g2 is under attack. I guess white could go queen d2, but we still have queen takes e3 with back rank ideas, as well as rook takes e3 with the idea of going rook e1 check. Actually, here I think white has rook takes d5, and things are not so clear. But queen takes e3, I think, is working with the intention of going queen e1 check next. So after h6, it's a bit fortunate, but it turns out all the tactics are nicely working out for black. If king to g1, the last kind of try, then black has rook takes e3. And here it's very important that the queen on g5 is defended, because on rook takes d5, we have rook takes e2, and we end up with an extra exchange in the endgame. So that's super critical. Otherwise white would have king g1 and rook takes d5 here if our pawn was on h5, for example, and then white would be doing just fine. So yeah, surprisingly, after h6, I think white is just lost. Like, I couldn't find a move for the opponent because we're just ready to take on e3. And white ended up playing rook takes d5, which is, I guess, better than everything else. If rook a1 or something, just trying to return to the back rank, it's simply too late. I mean, of course, knight is hanging, but also e3, and so, yeah, white can't do this. So, yeah, rook takes d5, white gives the exchange and tries to create this blockade with knight to d4, but I feel like this should be a pretty straightforward win from the get-go. Basically, white doesn't have enough material for the rook, and the rook has tons of targets in the position, which, yeah, of course, the knight can't cover everything. So I felt like my conversion was actually pretty clean. I started with queen a2, and I simply calculated here kind of a nice maneuver to play rook to b8, provoke b4, and then go queen a1 check and take on c3. So king g1 is played, white gets the king off the back rank, but yeah, rook b8, queen a1, and I'm immediately able to pick up one pawn, and I already felt like this position is just completely kind of hopeless for white as long as black doesn't blunder, which, okay, could still happen. Here I thought for a little bit. I ended up playing rook a8 with the idea of just trying to infiltrate with the rook, and eventually either threatening some kind of rook a2 idea or going after the e-pawn. So white played king g3. I play queen c5, just centralizing the queen, looking for some queen e5, some queen g5 check. Queen f3 was played. I went here. King goes back to f2. If king h3, I think I can already play rook a3 and go after this one. And it's very hard for white to defend here. So king f2 was played. I come in with the rook. I give another check. I gave this check. Queen to g3. I think the endgame would be totally winning for black, but I felt like it was stronger to keep queens on the board since white's king is pretty weak. So queen e4. Now if queen takes d6, there's rook a2 check and g2 falls, so that's pretty bad for white. So queen f3. I gave this check. King g3. Now if white had played king to g1, of course there's queen b1 check, which is possible, but I think I might have just played, well, queen b1 check followed by queen b2 definitely looks like a clear win. But I definitely would have strongly considered just going for the endgame in this version, since white's king is cut off on the back rank. And then just bringing the king, and it should be a very, very straightforward win for black. So white played king g3. Now queen e5 check. King h3. If queen to f4, my idea was to go g5, which I thought was nice, forcing white to trade on e5, but then we take with the pawn, the knight loses its square. Then after knight c6, I just go f6, defend this one, and the b pawn is very hard for white to push, and black can just bring the king in next. So king h3 was played, but now I have rook a3, and white no longer can defend the e pawn. If knight f5, then just king h7 first, followed by g6, and the knight will have to move. Queen e6 and then g6 I think is also okay. And if knight c2, then rook to b3, and the pawn on the b file will be lost, and so black can slowly win from there. So white tried a kind of last-ditch effort, queen to c6, just giving up the e pawn, but hoping to run the b pawn. But of course, it's not enough. Black is too active. Rook takes e3, knight f3. And yeah, here I was calculating for a little bit. I was just trying to figure out the fastest way to win pretty much. And I found a very violent idea here, but I thought it ended up being quite strong. That was just the move g5. So setting up a mate with queen f4, queen h4, also some ideas like h5, g4, just getting the pawns in. Of course, the knight is pinned. There's nothing white can really do about this. And yeah, black's pieces are nicely centralized, so there's no real checks or counterplay. b6 was played, queen f4. So I'd calculated, of course, b7, queen h4 is made already. White played queen c8 check, king g7, and tried g3 just to avoid the mate and get the b pawn rolling, but took a little bit of calculation here, but not too long to see that black is still just mating after queen takes knight, b7, queen h5 check, rook e2, and then either king f1, queen f3, queen g2 mates, or king g1, queen takes h2, and mate next move there. So this was resigned. So yeah, pretty interesting game. I felt like I played quite a reasonable game. I don't think the opening or late opening, early middle game was perfect for me. I remember when I was analyzing this one around here, Stockfish was definitely saying that it prefers white's position after a move like c4 and trying to get a quick c5. And the engine, of course, it sees a lot of concrete lines and finds a lot of interesting stuff. But during the game, yeah, I wasn't like too concerned about this one because on c4, you know, my plan was to play f5, e4, f4, and just get the king side pawns rolling. And yeah, it's a very double-edged position, but of course, that's kind of what I signed up for playing this line. But yeah, I definitely could have played the opening a little bit cleaner. I think instead of ba4, bishop g5 here is probably equalizing for black. But once we got this middle game, you know, with the knight versus bishop, I thought I found a lot of interesting ideas and a lot of tactics. Definitely very lucky with this rook a5, h6 spot. But yeah, overall, I felt like I found some good moves in this game. So yeah, definitely felt quite reasonable about it. Now I'm on 4.5 out of 5. There's 4 more rounds to go. And they're going to be very, very tough, of course. So yeah, I'm going to keep trying my best. And it's one game a day, which makes the schedule very nice and comfortable and gives me time to do game recaps. So very happy to be able to yeah, have good time before the game and then be able to like recap the game, put it up, and have people follow. So yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for all the support, and I will see you folks in the next one. Take care.